In the world of the dead, Necropia, a realm where no trace of life can be found, a grand castle stood amidst the barren lands, the only castle in Necropia. Countless indescribable things could be found there. Endless rows of golden pillars rose all around, and majestic paintings covered the walls. A vast marble hall with elegant sculptures gracefully carved atop everything. A symbol of absolute power. The master of all that existed there. The absolute ruler of Necropia. The king of death named Karnak. Being a transcendent and ruler of death, it had only been 100 years since he came to a conclusion. A human should not rule something like death. When he was human, Carnac was an illegitimate child of a noble. In his youth, he lost his mother to the violence in his home. Relying only on himself, Carnac naturally developed a desire to become powerful. It was then that he accidentally discovered a forbidden text about necromancy. In the end, he strayed from the path of humanity. Soon after, Carnac brought all humans and his kingdom to death with his vast power. The 4 great martial kings and the 3 sage archmages tried to resist, waging a brutal battle, but in the end, Carnac turned them all into his loyal servants. The world's guardians also tried to stop Carnac. However, when he turned the last guardian of the world, the Dragon Emperor Grateria, into his subordinate, Carnac transformed his own flesh into the supreme ascendant, Astra Schnaf. With that, he became the most powerful necromancer. The king of death had emerged. Carnac thought everything had become his, that he could do whatever he wanted. But that was 70 years ago. The protagonist wonders what he could do being just a bag of bones. Carnac questions how much longer he would have to keep living this way. A gentle, refreshing breeze on a sunny morning, the comforting touch of a human, or even a terrible pain deeply felt in the flesh. Carnac thinks that either would be better than this empty, tedious life he leads. The protagonist says that there is still hope. He looks at a scripture on the stone, thinking that if it works, suddenly, someone starts to approach, calling Carnac, Lord of all the dead, Master of life and death, Emperor of the continent. He says he greets His Majesty, the King of Death, Carnac. This is Baros, the General Commander of the Legion of Death. Carnac looks at him and says that everything is ready. Baros asks what it really is. Carnac laughs, saying he has the impression that it will work this time. Baros starts getting all excited, saying that finally, with Baros' help, the protagonist has been searching for a way to feel the pleasures of the flesh again. Vampirism, possession. The pleasures work by filling the voids one has. Carnac thinks that for them, the ascendants, no method worked. But as he was an ascendant, he was eventually able to find an answer to the search for pleasure. If they couldn't feel human pleasures because they weren't human, they could simply return to the time when they were human. Carnac says he wanted to go back to the day when he obtained the dark magical power. Baros asks if they fail, would their existences disappear? Carnac asks him why he is so attached to the life he currently has. The protagonist says that if Baros asked, he would leave him there and try to go back alone. Baros looks at his leader and says he would never do that, emphasizing that it's all or nothing, and urges his master to get on with it. Carnac says they will go back to those days. The two start to touch the stone, and a strong light fills the place. He thinks they will go back to the time when they were human. Everything turns white, and suddenly the protagonist starts to hear a voice calling him. Carnac begins to slowly open his eyes and starts to hear more clearly someone calling him. As soon as he wakes up more fully, a man was looking at him, saying that he had finally woken up. Carnac asks if the man in front of him is Baros. The man smiles, confirming that it is indeed him. Baros remarks that it had been a while since he had seen the protagonist's human face. Baros says that the protagonist is exactly the same as before. Skinny, black hair, and even the same arrogance. The protagonist wonders if he really looks like that. Carnac comments that Baros is as cheeky as ever. Carnac stands up, searching for something. He says that if they really did successfully return, he finally finds it and says that this is where it all began. He explains that he followed the path of necromancy with the knowledge he obtained from this codex. The protagonist says that he would test it. He snaps his fingers, and a lightning bolt shoots from his hand, hitting the book, which begins to burn. Baros doesn't understand why he did that. Carnac says that this was the power he had back then, but Baros asks if it's really safe to burn the codex like that. Carnac replies that it doesn't matter because he has everything absolutely memorized. He emphasizes that although it's a forbidden codex, there was nothing fantastic about it. It was all very basic. The protagonist comments that it's better not to leave any trace of it. Baros looks at the protagonist, saying that he really thought of everything and mentions that he even seems more radiant. The two look at each other, and suddenly their stomachs growl. They marvel at this. Karnak asks how long it's been since they last heard that sound. Barrows smiles, saying he feels like eating. The two leave the cave as the protagonist says they're going to look for something to eat. Barrows cheers at this. In the city, people passing by on the street were startled by the shouts of, "This is so delicious." Inside the restaurant, even the people were looking at them. Barrows was shouting, asking where they had made that bread, because it was a work of art. He emphasizes that he could feel everything. He takes another bite of the bread, crying and shouts again, saying that he would die to feel this every day. Carnac also starts crying and shouts to Barrows that they can't talk about death after everything he did to bring them back to life. Barrows says it's just an expression. He comments that coming back to life was really the best thing, emphasizing that the food was so delicious, he couldn't stop crying. Carnac, also crying, says he understands, but that he shouldn't overdo it because money doesn't grow on trees. He tells Barrows that he has to chew over and over again to really savor it. Barrows asks the protagonist to control himself as well, but he himself couldn't stay calm. The protagonist says he's about to faint just from the smell. The waiter serves a roasted chicken at the next table. As soon as they notice it, the two quickly turn and wonder if that's chicken and if that restaurant has any awards. The protagonist wonders how much it costs because he would love to eat some juicy meat right now. He says there's no way they could afford that because he comes from a ruined noble family. The protagonist starts smiling, saying that maybe he could just kill everyone there and take the meat for himself. Barrows goes crazy at this, shouting that he can't do that and begs the protagonist to calm down. Barrows emphasizes that with their current strength, they would get beaten up, so he should stay calm while Barrows checks how much money they have. He opens the coin pouch and says that being poor should be a sin. He asks if they should just order one more piece of bread. Barrows notices something and calls his master. He says that they have a big problem. Carnac asks what he means by that. Barrows replies that something went wrong with their time travel. The protagonist looks at the pouch and says that this is very strange. Barrows comments that there is definitely something wrong. He couldn't believe they had so many coins like that, and most of them were silver. Carnac wonders when things started to go wrong. Back then, his family's financial situation was very precarious. As a result, his grandfather, Baron Grelid, started several businesses in the territory, but failed in all of them, leaving only debts for the protagonist's father, Baron Kroput. Unfortunately, he was unable to manage the debts, which only grew larger. Moreover, the two sons from his original wife were two useless brats to the family. Carnac, the illegitimate child born in the midst of this family's collapse, received all the scorn and disdain, barely surviving as the days went by. He thinks that at least that's how his family should be. So how? The protagonist takes the coins in his hand and wonders where all that money came from. He comments that they shouldn't celebrate, as perhaps the time-space regression magic went wrong. Barrows says he has no idea since he was just a knight. The protagonist begins to worry, wondering if they didn't actually return to the past, but he's confused because everything looks just like he remembers. While Carnac is concerned, Barrows calls him, saying that this means they can eat chicken because the smell is driving him crazy. The protagonist is delighted by the idea. Barrows comments that nothing stops them from using that money. The two start imagining the king chicken. Carnac agrees, saying they would be able to think better on a full stomach. Barrows, with his mouth watering, suggests they could order just one. The protagonist replies that he doesn't want to share, so they'll get one for each of them. They shout to the waiter, ordering 2 whole chickens. A few hours later, they are both full. Barrows is round from eating so much. He pats his belly, sighing, and says he's stuffed, having eaten so much that he might fall into a food coma. As they ride their horses, Carnac comments that they could sleep as soon as they get back. Barrows says that having to see those people again is a bit annoying because they're probably the same, and he says he hates those people. The protagonist responds that they'll be fine as long as they don't pay attention to any of them, emphasizing that he's no longer the same as he was back then. Carnac comments that the problem is how strange things are. Barrows agrees, saying it's not like there are just 1 or 2 strange things. He notes that even the horse was strange. He asks if the protagonist noticed how the manager was sucking up to them, smiling, and saying they would take the best possible care of the horses. It didn't make sense for a family of failures to have such high-quality horses. Barrows says that even the citizens they saw earlier, those who used to call them failure and assistant of the failure, surprised them when it happened. The people were happy to see them and even cried. Barrows comments that he thought they were in an inn. The protagonist agrees, saying that all of this is indeed very strange. Barrows says they will figure out a lot once they get home, as they're almost there. Looking at the place, Carnac comments that he's feeling nostalgic, because it's been a long time since he's seen it. Barrows, however, says he doesn't feel that way because he doesn't have good memories there. Barrows was an orphan and didn't live a very good life. His parents were crappy mercenaries who abandoned him in the middle of the night. Carnac found him alone and brought him home, and to the protagonist's surprise, Crapette allowed it. Carnac thinks that even though he was an illegitimate child, the family needed to maintain appearances, and he would need some kind of assistant. Barrows taps the protagonist's shoulder, calling him. The protagonist asks what he wants. Barrows points to the house, asking if that's really the gestured house. The protagonist looks and confirms it, but is speechless. The house was perfectly beautiful. Barrows asks if they went to the wrong place. Carnac says no, it's definitely the right place. A large brick wall, a 2-story building with a terrace, a large garden around it. He thinks it's the same, but it's still impressive. He comments that it looks like the whole place was renovated, but he doesn't know where all the money came from. As soon as the guards see them, they smile, calling out to the protagonist. Carnac is amazed, thinking that even the gatekeeper is now welcoming him. The other guard reprimands the first one, saying that's not how they should speak. Both of them bow and say, "Welcome, my lord," leaving Carnac and Barrows completely shocked, not understanding anything and wondering why they were called Lord. They finally enter the family mansion. Someone mentions that it's been 6 months since the protagonist became the head of the family. The two are in disbelief when they hear this. The protagonist asks if it really has been 6 months. The butler, named Japple Plead, smiles and asks if the protagonist got what he wanted. Carnac, confused, asks what it is. Japple asks if that wasn't the reason for his journey. The protagonist, still lost in the situation, doesn't know what to say. Japple says he's glad, noting that the former lord and Isabella were also pleased. Once again, the two are shocked by this. The protagonist wonders if his father and stepmother really did die. Japple comments that after the deaths of Teszel and Feralth, the atmosphere became quite strange, but it seems to have improved now. Carnac thinks that's why he became the lord and wonders what the hell is happening and why his entire family is dead. The reason for his journey was obvious. He was probably mastering necromancy while no one was paying attention. Barrows bends down and quietly speaks to the protagonist, saying he doubted that he had revealed his true objectives. Carnac agrees, commenting that he must have made up some other story to justify the journey, but he doesn't understand why he would use necromancy in a situation like this. Japple, with a beautiful smile on his face, asks what is troubling the protagonist. Barrows steps in and says that the protagonist was just mentioning that the journey had left him tired, and asks if they could continue the conversation tomorrow. Japple becomes desperate, apologizing and saying he hadn't considered it from that perspective. He asks the protagonist to hurry and rest in his room. As soon as Japple leaves the room, the two clasp hands. Carnac says that Barrows did a good job. Barrows replies that they got away with it for now, but asks what they're going to do, as everything Japple said is news to him, and he has no idea what's happening there. Carnac asks if there's anything they can do in a situation like this. Barrows asks what that would be, and the protagonist, smiling, says they need to leave soon, taking advantage of the fact that everyone is asleep. During the night, Japple was sleeping, and the two went to his room. Barrows comments that the butler was sleeping like a rock. He hands a bowl to the protagonist, saying these are the medicinal herbs he prepared, noting that it took him a while to get them. Carnac takes them and says it's time to start the mental probing. He applies a bit of magic to the bowl, and the smoke from the herbs begins to enter Japple's nose. The protagonist says, "Rise, my servant." Suddenly, the butler opens his eyes and stands up, exuding a strange aura, and responds, "Yes, master." The protagonist orders him to explain in detail how Zastrid's finances recovered and how he became the family's patriarch. Japple begins to explain that it happened 4 years ago, while the second eldest son was on his training journey. He ended up discovering a large copper mine and brought financial stability to them. The protagonist is astonished by this and asks if nobles don't usually use a copper mine as an excuse to hide dirty money. Barrows comments that this is true but emphasizes that Japple couldn't lie in this state. Carnac asks why everyone in the family died within 4 years. The butler explains that the problem was the location of the copper mine, which was in the neutral zone between the Zastrid house and Viscount de Venner. Both houses claimed ownership of the mine, and this resulted in a war between the domains. Deventer was powerful, amassing forces since the previous generation. Chapel notes that the biggest obstacle was Sir Randolph, who single-handedly decapitated Baron Kraput, the former patriarch, and also killed the first son, young Master Tezcel. The strongest knight of the Zastrid house, the second eldest son, Ferald, lost his legs because of Randolph and took his own life. Even the Baroness fell ill from the shock and eventually died. As a result, Lord Carnac became the successor, even though he was not of age, and the two houses agreed to a ceasefire until he came of age to officially become the patriarch. However, everyone was still worried because of the copper mine and the significant profits at stake in the war. That's when the protagonist brought forth a way to save the Zastrid house. Carnac stepped forward and shouted, "In the name of Alium, goddess of the moon and justice, we request a trial by combat against Viscount Deventer." The protagonist starts shouting, asking Japel to wait a moment. He asks why he requested this trial. Barrows questions why the protagonist thought he could do something so risky. Trial by combat is a duel conducted according to the doctrine of Alium, the goddess of the moon and justice. It allows a champion to participate in the duel in place of another person. The process is presided over by a priest of Alium and is decided by the death of one of the parties. Barrows tells the protagonist that he dug his own grave, but Carnac responds that he didn't, emphasizing that this is why everyone likes him now. Since the battle is determined by the quality of the combatants, he must have opted for a trial by combat instead of a war between domains. This way, Deventer couldn't refuse the offer, or else they would suffer a blow to their reputation. The protagonist comments that if they give up the copper mine alone and not the compensation, at least by doing the trial by combat, they wouldn't starve. So, he thinks this was the best possible decision. Barrows says that if the protagonist fights with the skills he currently has, he'll just die in vain. Carnac says that's why he's going to prepare perfectly. He asks when the trial by combat is scheduled. Japel responds that it's in a month. The two are shocked, thinking it's sooner than they expected. After some time, the two go to the table, which is filled with food. In a trembling voice, Barrows asks the protagonist what all this is for. Carnac says it's for Barrows, since he's been working so hard, so he can eat as much as he wants. Delighted Barrows shouts, thanking him for the food. As he eats, Barrows asks if it's okay for them to be doing this, considering the duel is approaching. The protagonist smiles and asks if Barrows wouldn't like to participate in his place. Barrows suggesting that he could be the champion. While eating, Barrows comments that there's a reason behind all this, but he declines, saying that for now, it's impossible for him. Carnac asks why it would be impossible, since Barrows had defeated 3 of the 4 great martial kings. Barrows responds that it was all thanks to the protagonist's necromancy, because martial power isn't just about experience. He gives the example that excellent swordsmanship is useless to a person without an arm. Barrows says that maybe it would be possible if he trained well for 6 months, but in 1 month, it's impossible. Carnac gets angry and tells him to stop eating, taking the food out of his hand. Barrows tells him to stop being stingy with the food. He suggests to the protagonist that he finds someone from the house's knightly order. The protagonist asks if he really believes they would be in this situation if they had such a good fighter. Carnac says this leaves only one option. He will have to use necromancy. Barrows comments that now he understands why his master learned necromancy. However, the protagonist points out a small problem. If they use necromancy, they will be discovered, as it is a forbidden art. Carnac asks Barrows if he remembers the first time they fled. People were searching for them, shouting that the blessing of Ilium would be with whoever found that demon. The protagonist recalls that they secretly took care of the household members with necromancy, but the priests of Ilium accused the protagonist of being guilty. The soldiers finally cornered them, calling them demons. They were certain that Carnac was a necromancer. Seeing that there was no way out, the protagonist begins to chant, "Come, wandering vengeful spirits, extinguish the fate of the living with the light of the abyss." Several souls begin to appear called vengeful wraith spirits. The soldier starts shouting that he was using necromancy and manipulating an evil spirit. They prepare themselves, and as the spirits advance, the soldiers use talismans. The talisman is a sacred relic of the Ilium order, capable of subduing evil energy. However, this wasn't enough. The spirits begin to attack everyone there, and they scream that the goddess's blessing wasn't working. The protagonist continues controlling the spirits and ordering them to attack the soldiers. In no time, all of them were dead. Carnac says they need to run because the next group would soon catch up to them. The protagonist wonders how the priests detected the necromancy since the book said necromancy would be undetectable. Barrows starts reading the book and explains that this only works on common people, like knights and mages. Apparently, clerics are an exception. The protagonist is shocked to learn this. Returning to the present, Barrows starts laughing, saying that was really a problem back then. The protagonist comments that it was the beginning of the legend. Barrows says he can guess what the plan was, thinking about the past. Carnac sighs, saying he must have tried to use necromancy secretly, pretending it was a normal fight. However, the judges of a trial by combat are priests, who are clerics. The past will just repeat itself if he uses necromancy there. But he emphasizes that he doesn't want to be hunted down again like last time. Barrows suggests they take the money and flee secretly. He volunteers to find out where the jewels and the domain's funds are kept. Karnak asks if that wouldn't be a waste, since all the useless family members were dead and all the residents liked him. Barrows comments that it seems Karnak wants to continue acting as a good patriarch and tells the protagonist to do as he pleases. But he'll go ahead and prepare for his funeral. The protagonist says that doesn't sound very encouraging to hear and asks Barrows to wait a moment and sit down again. Karnak comments that it's not very safe, but he has a great idea. In the fortress north of Devantair, training was underway. The instructor orders everyone to stop as they'll take a short break before continuing. While everyone is exhausted and crying from the heavy training, Randolph stands among them. Suddenly, someone arrives and asks if the preparations for the trial by combat were going well. Randolph looks at Bright and asks what he needs to prepare against an abandoned nerd. Bright agrees, but comments that carelessness is a sin, suggesting that maybe the protagonist has some plan. Randolph starts mocking, saying that Bright is worrying too much. Bright thinks it's impossible for Randolph to lose, but he still wonders why the new Lord of Zestrad challenged them to a duel. Suddenly, he hears some voices and turns around, seeing several people, with a man crouching down. He asks if that guy is another traveling merchant, noting that it's strange since many have been showing up lately. Bright turns away, saying it was distracting him, and then looks at all the warriors and orders them back to training. The merchant smiles. It was Barrows, who says he's starting to get an idea of what's going on. He watches Randolph's training, thinking it was a good idea to come and take a look. As he sees Randolph training, he thinks that while Randolph may not be powerful in combat, in a one-on-one battle, his opponent actually has a chance of winning. Barrows comments that Randolph is the type of dumb fighter who uses common heavy sword techniques. He hasn't even learned to use battle aura yet. It's easy to predict the movements of opponents like him. In any case, this is good for Barrows, but even so, he thinks that at this rate, a month still won't be enough. Suddenly, a woman arrives and asks if he has something to discuss with her brother since he's been staring at him for a while. Barrows turns around, smiling, and asks if she is Randolph's sister. The woman responds that she is, and asks if he has something to settle with him. Barrows says that he was influenced by the vigor of the strongest knight in the north, but in his mind, he thinks that Randolph is a complete idiot. He offers her some handkerchiefs, asking if she likes any of them, and mentions that he could give her a special price. She approaches Barrows and points to one of the handkerchiefs, saying that it's very beautiful. He starts laughing, saying that she has great taste, and while wondering if she had noticed anything. Sometime later in the personal training room of the Jestert family, Barrows arrives, informing the protagonist that he's back and asking how his training is going. As soon as Barrows looks ahead, he sees the protagonist nearly passed out on the ground. He rushes to the protagonist and starts shaking him, yelling for him to wake up. Carnac asks him to stop shaking him like that, or he's going to die for real. Barrows asks the protagonist if he completed the 50 laps around the field as he said he would. The protagonist, still trembling, responds that he just finished and passed out. He can't run anymore. Barrows comments that this is a serious lack of energy. Carnac gets angry and asks why he was training like that in the first place. Barrows says that the protagonist can't do anything with that stick-thin body of his, so he should keep trembling and nearly dying. The protagonist says he needs to rest a little first. Barrows stands up and goes to the protagonist, asking what this word rest is, because now they're going to start the real training. The protagonist is startled, asking what he had been doing until now if it wasn't the real training. Barrows responds that it was just the warm-up. With a frightening smile, Barrows says they should begin the training now, 20 days until the duel. First, he should make sure to have a good breakfast, then they should go to the field and do 100 push-ups. Afterward, to compensate, they should do 100 staff swings, 100 squats, and right after trembling, the protagonist asks if they'll rest. Barrows responds that they can rest a bit, but after the rest, They'll have another meal, more push-ups, staff swings again, more squats, and then another rest. This was repeated several times throughout the day. After 5 days, the protagonist was already exhausted, but he was still having some difficulties. Barrows comes up to him, saying that finally, Carnac has shown some improvement. The protagonist agrees, saying he's been training hard, but still can't compare to Barrows. He comments that it's because Barrows trained twice as much as he's been training. Barrows grabs a sword and says it's time to start swordsmanship training. The protagonist throws the bags on the ground and says that the time has finally come. Barrows hands the sword to him. Just by seeing Carnac holding the sword, Barrows comments that it was horrifying. He starts circling the protagonist, saying that his arms are trembling, asking where the protagonist is looking, and explaining that he should relax his shoulders, distribute his weight, bend his knees more, and steady his arms. They begin training, and Barrows makes the protagonist repeat the same movement several times. Carnac is exhausted, thinking that Barrows is very demanding. Barrows comments that if the protagonist keeps improving like this, he won't lose his head in the first attack. He tells the protagonist to get ready because he's going to attack him now. Carnac smiles, saying he'll control himself. Barrows strikes so hard that he hits the protagonist very quickly. He prepares to attack again and asks what the protagonist is doing, telling him to assume his position again. The protagonist keeps getting beaten, thinking that Barrows' barrage of attacks makes it difficult to counterattack. So all he can do is stay in position. Suddenly, one of Barrows' attacks hits his stomach so hard that the protagonist cries out in pain and falls to the ground with a thud. Barrows comments that this is why knights can have a field day against civilians, emphasizing that knights don't give the opponent a chance to counterattack. He says that the protagonist should stay in position and dodge the attacks. Carnac responds that he already knows that, but even while staying in position, he can't dodge the next attack. Barrows explains that this is obvious because the purpose of that training is to show Randolph the protagonist's determination to fight. Carnac asks if he will have to do this during the duel. Barrows says that Randolph has a habit of wanting to show off, so he will try to display his skills to the spectators by toying with his opponent. However, this changes if the opponent loses the will to fight. A draw would harm Randolph's honor, so he will try to win at all costs. Barrows says that's why the protagonist must show him that he won't give up no matter what. Barrows says that the protagonist must do this if he doesn't want to die right at the beginning. 5 days before the duel, Carnac was different. He was confident and attacked Barrows, who kept correcting the protagonist's posture and movements. Barrows strikes him and yells louder. Suddenly, another attack comes as a surprise, catching the protagonist off guard. Barrows yells at him to make sure he's being heard. With a quick move, the protagonist manages to defend himself, but Barrows' attack is so strong that it throws him away, causing him to fall to the ground and slide until he hits the wall. Barrows scolds him, saying he can't be hit at all, otherwise, he'd be turned into sushi. He tells the protagonist that he must always roll on the ground. Completely worn out, Carnac thinks this would be shameful. For days before the duel, the protagonist manages to roll on the ground, but he can't, though he was crying due to Barrows' strength. 3 days before the duel, Carnac was like a Beyblade, rolling all over the place while dodging attacks. 2 days before the duel, the protagonist was already rolling in a different way, managing to get up quickly. The training was so intense that the protagonist comments that at this rate, he would end up dying before the duel even started. Barrows approaches him and says he's doing very well, highlighting that he's almost ready. Barrows stands in front of him and asks if they should continue training. The two stare at each other, and Barrows says he's going to teach him the swordsmanship of the 4 martial kings. The protagonist is surprised and asks if Barrows really knew about such things. Barrows sighs and says yes, he knew everything. He begins to explain that the 4 martial kings were all his apprentices. He emphasizes that he learned all the techniques, except for Queen Rapunzel's. The protagonist asks why he didn't learn her technique. Barrows responds that he didn't learn it because the protagonist didn't turn her into a death knight. She resisted until the end. So, the protagonist reduced her to pieces and turned her into a guard. Carnac remembers this and comments that it was very evil of him. Barrows says that doesn't matter and states that what the protagonist is going to learn now is the Defied sword technique from the martial king Levon. Carnac asks if he could really learn that in 2 days since it's the technique of a martial king. Barrows asks why he wants 2 days if they'll only need 1. Finally, the day of the duel arrived, on the border between Devantaire and Jestard. People were gathering and talking. One young man asks another who he thinks will win, and they say that, without a doubt, it will be Randolph. On the other side, People from the Zestrad house wondered if the protagonist could really win. Some said he had been training hard day after day, so they should trust him. The decisive moment finally arrived. Karnak approaches, confident, accompanied by his trainer and aide, Baros. People start gathering around the arena. A person approaches and strikes their staff, asking everyone to be silent in the presence of Alium. He says that both houses claimed ownership of the copper mines and thus requested a trial. The ownership of the mine will be decided through a duel. Carnac, from the Jestard house, must step forward and face the goddess. Randolph, from Devinter, must also step forward and face the goddess. The man informs that before the fight, according to the rules, a restriction was applied to the equipment based on the fighter's abilities. He asks both, in the name of Alium, if they swear to fight honorably. Both swear. The man announces that the oath has been made, and now the scales of justice must seek the truth. He shouts, starting the trial by combat. The two stare at each other, and everyone begins to pay attention. Randolph comments that he admired the protagonist's courage for not running away, but that it didn't change anything. He begins to attack, and the protagonist defends himself with his shield, smiling. Carnac says they'll only know after trying. The protagonist attacks, but Randolph retreats, admitting that the protagonist really wasn't all talk. Randolph keeps attacking, but the protagonist defends himself from all the blows he receives. People cheer, saying that the protagonist was having a decent fight. Baros watches in silence, commenting that the beginning was going as expected. Neither too fast nor threatening, Randolph was just studying his opponent. Karnak thinks he should stick with what he trained. Now, he should show his will to fight. The protagonist stops and starts yelling, calling Randolph to the fight. Randolph looks at the protagonist and notices that his eyes are full of determination. He lacks skill, but he has spirit. Randolph prepares to attack, saying it's time to increase the difficulty. The protagonist notices that Randolph's sword energy has increased and realizes he won't be able to block that attack with his shield. Randolph continues his attack, causing a great impact in the arena, but the protagonist starts rolling, as trained, dodging the blows. Randolph is confused by this, wondering what kind of crude skill that was. The people start to get excited, saying that their lord was truly skillful. They comment that, although strange, the method was effective, but they had never seen anything like it before. Karnak throws the shield away and says that Randolph is nothing, that he didn't even need the shield. The protagonist begins to mock, calling Randolph so slow that he mistook him for a turtle. Karnak asks if a muscle-bound pig like Randolph was really a knight. Randolph, very irritated, curses the protagonist and asks if Karnak is really going to keep mocking him, because if so, he will make sure the protagonist never speaks again. Karnak prepares and smiles, telling Randolph to try his worst. Randolph is confused by this, but, full of rage, notices the protagonist's stance and realizes it's the Delphiad sword technique. The people begin to comment on the protagonist's stance, saying it was created by the martial king Lavun, one of the 4 martial kings. They become happy, believing that their lord trained with the techniques of the martial kings. Randolph thinks he almost fell for the protagonist's trick and realizes he needs to calm down and focus on the fight. The sword techniques of the martial kings can only be used by geniuses with real battle experience, and he believes the protagonist is far from capable of using them properly. Randolph wonders how that idiot managed to learn that technique, but acknowledges that learning it is indeed difficult. Praising the protagonist's effort, Randolph points his sword at the protagonist and declares that since Carnac is the new lord of the Jestard state, he will act justly in Ilium's name. He thinks the protagonist can't defeat him. Carnac becomes worried by Randolph's gaze, believing it will be enough to finish him off. The protagonist recalls the conversation he had with Baros. He asks Baros if he really thinks it's possible to learn the martial king's technique. Baros replies that he barely needs to copy it. The protagonist still worries about this, but Baros says that the protagonist won't have to pick up the sword again once everything is over. Therefore, he only needs to show enough skill for people to believe he was training, because their real plan is something else. Returning to the fight, Carnac is getting beaten up, thinking he wasn't warned that he'd go through this. He starts defending the attacks, thinking that he still needs to do what needs to be done, even while crying. The protagonist yells that this is nothing, and asks if Randolph really thought it would be enough to defeat the Jestard house lineage. Randolph wonders what the protagonist is talking about, since he's getting beaten like crazy. The protagonist shouts that the Jestard sword will never fall. The people become emotional with the protagonist's determination and wonder if they really thought he was just a clown. The protagonist yells, asking if Randolph was scared. People start getting emotional, crying, and saying that even if the protagonist is an idiot, he is a great lord. Barros watches the fight, smiling, and thinks that Carnac isn't receiving any direct hits. It seems that spending almost 30 days beating him up was worth it. Carnac keeps getting beaten and calls Randolph a worthless knight, daring him to come at him. Barros thinks that his lord has always had a talent for talking nonsense. Extremely irritated, Randolph thinks he's tired of continuing this. He looks at the protagonist and says that he's barely holding on, asking what he was talking about. But the protagonist keeps calling Randolph to fight. Randolph unleashes his power and charges forward with impressive speed, yelling that it's time to end this. Barros sees this and becomes anxious, thinking that the moment has finally arrived. He shouts, telling the protagonist to be careful. With that, Carnac wonders if it's time. He remembers Barros emphasizing that, even if he manages to mimic the movements without a real attack, everyone will see it as just a trick. That's why Barros explained exactly what the protagonist would have to do. Barros had said that, at the end of the fight, Randolph would attack the protagonist's legs to limit his movements. At the right moment, the protagonist should switch to a defensive stance, and with that, throw his opponent to the ground. Randolph comes in full force, and the protagonist manages to block the attack. Randolph is impressed, wondering how an amateur blocked that. Barros had instructed that, after blocking the attack, the protagonist should swing his sword upward in a diagonal arc. The protagonist does exactly that, striking Randolph's sword. Barros had said that after this move, the protagonist should change his sword grip and attack once more. With Randolph's guard open thanks to the protagonist's first move, he is struck by the second attack. This attack is called the double killer uppercut. Blood begins to drip on the arena floor and Carnac sighs exhausted. Randolph starts to laugh with a small cut on his chest and asks if that was all the protagonist had. He comments that a cat would hurt more than that attack. Carnac sees this and thinks the situation is not looking good. With this, the chapter ends here. I hope that you liked today's video, and if you did, hit that like button as today's like goal is 100 likes. Comment next part down below for the next part. Also, consider subscribing with the notification bell on to get notified as soon as a new video drops onto the channel. I'll meet you in the next video. Until then, thanks for watching.